Well, hello everyone. How are you?
Good. How are
Good.
you?
Great. Great to see you guys. Welcome to this edition of the A Life Design Roundtable. And today our topic is great books. So I'm so
Mm.
excited. We have some readers among us here. And we've read all kinds of books, books that we read to enjoy, books that we read to learn a skill or improve our work or just expand our minds in philosophy and faith. So we'll go over some of those today. And let's see, I'm going to show slides. Really,
Mhm.
it's just memes for the most part. And then we'll talk about books. Whatever books you talk about, I'll have them listed so that people can find them in the show notes. So let's see if I can go ahead and share. Not yet. Let's see.
Mm.
Um, I guess I'm going to start here and I'm going to change my screen to this. Oh, okay, my screen sharing is paused. Well, this is how this day is going. So we're going to start again. Share. There's my screen.
We got to see those book memes. Mm.
Yes. So we're shining light on books today, literally, figuratively. And we'll look at some memes real quick. Brian was the meme master this week. So our first meme here, I'll have to read it. When a book, I'm trying to see if I can make it bigger. I can't. When a book ends in a huge cliffhanger, this person is stunned, and underneath it says, "Hello, darkness, my old friend." Then here, accidentally closed a book, opened it right back on the page I was on. I've had that feeling.
Mhm.
That awkward moment when you realize you've created your own library and you're the librarian. So you've become a librarian in your life part-time.
It
And I
looks
love
like
this.
Dean's background. You can see all the
That's right.
books.
He's his own librarian. Um, then uh, the self-help shelf, the power of yes, the power of no. This is for coaching books. You know, I'm trying to see something. Oh,
The
the
secret,
secret of
the
work
the
more.
secret.
The secret of work less. It's all about them. It's all about you. So with self-help books, probably whatever point of view you're looking for, somebody wrote a book with that point of view to reconfirm whatever you're thinking about the world. So, um, but I know books have changed us, so I'm going to stop our share. Thanks for those fun memes, Brian. And
Oh yeah,
Brian and I moved to Texas. I think we moved 50 boxes. At least 20 of them were full of books. So,
yeah.
yeah, we've
And
now
I really,
dispersed.
I just don't carry books around anymore.
I know.
Now that I travel, maybe a couple, but
Yeah.
I'll read stuff online or maybe read an ebook
I
or
default to
something.
Kindle a lot. Yeah.
I mostly like I'll listen to audiobooks or I'll just watch educational videos now. That's like really what I do. So
Yeah.
I used to read a lot though.
Dean, I think you've collected a lot of books over time.
Uh, Surprisingly, Brian was referring to my bookshelf
Yeah.
here. Is
Hmm.
that right?
Yeah.
But most of my library is in boxes in the other room, right? But surprisingly, I've never read a book, so it might be hard for me to make any recommendations.
Not only have you read them, you've written them. So
That's right. I was going to say that books that really reflect my thinking are the ones I've written,
Nice.
yeah,
Nice.
the books you yourself have written.
right? They really reflect kind of I agree with that book a lot.
Very good, very good.
Nice.
Well, so Dean, where are you hailing from today?
I'm in the Lexington, Kentucky area.
Oh, very good. Okay. And for Brian,
Da Nang, Vietnam.
Da Nang, Vietnam. And
Yep.
it's evening for you there, right? It's morning here.
Yep. It's 11 o'clock for
I'm in
me at night.
Austin, Texas, beautiful Austin, Texas, and we
Hmm.
finally have winter. So it's
Mm.
rainy and cold, and kids are like fussing about putting on sweatshirts, wearing long pants. You know, other places the snow's coming down. So, but here it's cold and rainy. But well, perfect book reading weather, actually.
Mm.
If you have to stay
Yeah,
inside, read a book.
that's true.
One of the memes that did not fit on our slide that Brian found was Kermit reading a book, and underneath it said, well, the power's out. I guess I'll read this book for a while. You know, it's like, how do you entertain yourself when your screens are shut off? Well, you could read a book. Hmm. Well, Brian, would you like to begin about books you want to share?
Yeah, so I did one. This was a book that my pool coach recommended that I never read, but I just listened to the audiobook for this meeting, this
Yeah.
podcast, I guess we could call it. This is the only book he recommended
Okay.
out of all the books in the world, and it is a book written by a samurai. It's called The Book of the Five Rings by Miyamoto Musashi, who was
Yep.
in the like 1600s, that
Hmm.
type of
Very famous book.
yeah. And it's really a strategy book. It gets into the strategy of swordsmanship and fighting, but you can apply it to life. So I'll talk a little bit about it. Um, he gets into a lot of the depths of strategy and how other people who are swordsmen or samurai focus on things like their reflexes getting better or longer swords, these kinds of
Tools,
things.
athleticism. Mhm.
And he was like, no, this is not the true way. That's not the true strategy. So he discovered a whole lot of strategies to fighting. And I don't know, I didn't verify this, but in the book it says he was like undefeated in like 60 matches or something,
Mhm. As a
60
samurai.
duels to the death. Yeah. Um, so he talks about how in some schools they debate, should you fix your eyes on the sword of the opponent or on their hands or on their body? And he says, no, you look at the spirit of your opponent and you tune into that so you can predict their actions. You try to
Mhm.
see their intentions,
Mhm.
what they're going to do next, and you make sure you're ready to counter and exploit whatever weakness that opens them up to. So it's a lot of strategic stuff like this, but I think it really applies to life because actually everything in your life can be a strategy. There is a strategy for it, whether we choose to be conscious of that and use that, apply that strategy or not. So I'll talk some more about it. And then, so like, for example, he says in some schools, they'll teach you to just block with the sword. But he's like, you have to learn how to block and then also make a motion to cut their hand as you block.
Mhm.
I know this is violent, it's kind of, but we're just using
Mhm.
it to talk about strategy and
Mhm.
I'll kind of apply it to life in general. My point is there's so many things like that to everything we do in life, little strategies that you can discover that can make you more effective. So,
Mhm.
he's like, it's not just about blocking the sword. You have to learn correct timing
Mhm.
so that you're applying maximum force as you block so that you don't recoil back
Mhm.
from the clash of the swords because then you're off balance.
Mhm.
You're at a disadvantage. Your opponent can come in and, and
Mhm.
kill you. So, um, he's like, a lot of fighters just practice indoors, but you could easily get into a duel outdoors in mud on a hill in marshland. And so you have to train your feet of like how to balance on uneven ground, on like muddy ground, like all these different things. So he talks about how some opponents are like they're just using sort of the fingers as they hold the sword. He's like, no, you have to learn how to use the wrist and the palm. And he's like, after all these things, he says, study well, study. You have to keep learning these things and studying. And so obviously this kind of applies to pool.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so I think this is why, my coach recommended this, the cue can sort of be like a sword. It's not as violent, but um, so um, one thing that's really interesting is he talks about different spirits in fighting. This was part of sort of the samurai understanding, and
Mhm.
there's actually strategy around this.
Mhm.
So he's like, you have to know when to attack in a spirit of anger and just a full on assault. And he's like, you have to know when to be calm, put on a calm spirit. And so I think that applies to life too. Like we kind of have to know how to take on a certain attitude or a certain demeanor for
Mhm.
different situations.
Mhm.
You
Mhm.
can use that as a strategy to help you in life. But this is applying it to, duels
Mhm.
and battles. But he said if your opponent comes at you in a spirit of rage, you have to be calm so that you're not letting your opponent force you
Mhm.
into different positions,
Mhm. Mhm.
like where you have to recoil back and then they might know what to do after you recoil back
Mhm.
to get you. So you have to be calm and then right at the last moment, dodge and make your move.
Mhm.
Um, so let's see what else we got here. He says you need to train the strategy into your body
Mhm.
so that it becomes muscle memory. Like,
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
it happens like instantly. You
Mhm.
just like your body already knows what to do.
Mhm.
Um, and he says, allow your opponent to do useless things. Let them tire themselves out.
Mhm.
Only counter if they're doing something useful.
Mhm.
And it's kind of like the art of war, and I mean it's similar in some ways, but
Mhm.
it does get into some different things. So yeah, he said, even if you're outnumbered, like if it's an army battle, with a smaller numbers versus bigger numbers, he's like, you can often win with correct strategy.
Mhm.
And his point is that strategy really, if it's done very effectively, it can outweigh things like hard work, talent, dedication. He describes how smaller armies have beaten larger armies because they would instill in them a spirit of confusion.
Oh.
Like if you create a massive distraction and you get them all freaked out, you can come in even with a smaller army and win the battle.
Mhm.
He said sometimes even if they're larger than you, if you attack from all four corners and kind of box them in, the
Mhm.
people in the middle become useless.
Mhm.
They can't fight because they can't get to
Mhm.
the outside people who are actually fighting. So then their numbers don't matter.
Mhm.
It doesn't matter that they have more soldiers than you. There's like many
Mhm.
strategies like this. And if you think about war, some army could have 10,000 soldiers that dedicated their life to training and fighting and marksmanship. But if you have one bomb that
Mhm.
drops and takes them all out, that was all useless.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I'm saying this is the power of strategy. So
Mhm.
it can overcome like talent, hard work, dedication, like so many other factors if you have good strategy. So I think it's good to be aware of that and try to apply that to our lives.
Mhm.
Um, he kind of talks about how I'm sort of adding this in, but like resourcefulness is more important than resources
Oh.
oftentimes. If
Mhm.
you have the strategy of knowing how to win, even if you're out resourced or outnumbered,
Mhm.
very often you can win.
Mhm.
And I think that's a good lesson for people in life. If even if you come from not a lot of money, problematic, traumatic childhood or something, if you really create the correct strategy, you can lift yourself out of that and build a better life for yourself. So understanding the importance of like how effective strategy can be. Um, let's see. So I'm going to talk about pool hustlers a little bit. Okay. And there's some funny stories I'll talk about. And this applies. A lot of pool hustlers know really good strategy,
Mhm.
especially some of the famous ones. I'll talk about some of the old time ones.
Mhm.
And even if you're not as good of a pool player as other people, you can still win
Mhm.
big bets, big money off people with good strategy by how you set up the bet.
Mm.
So there's some of this is kind of almost almost cheating. It's kind of like rigging the game a little bit, but I'll give you some examples of how strategy can sort of be applied. And by the way, I think this is going on in every area of life all over the world. I think basically there's hustlers in crypto, in the
Oh,
stock
sure.
market that are manipulating
People that
prices,
appear
rigging the
before
game.
court in trial. Yeah, all
There you
kinds of
go.
things. Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, exactly. In courts, people do
Hmm.
this kind of stuff,
Hmm.
falsify things or plant evidence or whatever.
Hmm.
This stuff goes on. Casinos, they rig it so that they always win. They make billions of dollars. I would argue that most governments around the world are basically hustling the citizens. I mean, it's a
Sure.
hustle. They're telling you, hey, just give us billions, trillions of dollars and we'll make your society better. And then they just line their pockets with it. It's basically a hustle. It's like a pool hustle.
It is. Yeah.
I don't think people think of it that way, but I mean, honestly, it's the same principles. So,
It's just billions instead of hundreds.
yeah, or trillions. I mean, in the US case, it's trillions.
Mhm.
So let me give you an example. This is I read Amarillo Slim's book. That was a very famous pool hustler. He also hustled in poker and other things. And he describes the hustle, many of the hustles he did. So this is the power strategy. He one time won a big bet, like I don't know, $10,000 or something. And this was like 19, I don't know, 50s or 60s or something. I don't know when, but like a while back. So that was like real money back then. Um, he beat a national champion at ping pong, even though he didn't play ping pong. He won the bet. This is a hustle. This. You want to know how he did it? He went up, he started talking shit. He had a whole plan. He went up, he started talking shit to the national ping pong champion. And he was like, I can beat you in ping pong. No problem. And the guy's like, you can't beat me. I'm a national champion. And he's like, I'll beat you easily. And the guy's like, okay, fine. How much money you want to bet? As much as you want. So they bet like $10,000. He's like, okay, I'll play you ping pong. First one to 21 points. He's like, I get to choose the paddles. That's the only stipulation. The guy's like, you're on, bet. No problem. So he goes, he practices for a month playing ping pong with a frying pan, like a curved, like weird pan. And he gets it down to where he can like work the ball. And he challenges the guy and he beats him because he got to chose the paddles. He chose the frying pan. I mean, it's like there's a lot of stories like this. But this is the power of strategy. If you set up
Mhm.
the bet correctly, or if you set up your life correctly,
Mhm.
I mean, you can overcome incredible talent, incredible hard work, incredible
Mhm.
dedication with just strategy. And I don't recommend everyone hustling people. I'm not arguing for that. And
Mhm.
I didn't hustle people when I played pool. I mean, I would gamble, but it wasn't hustling. It was just people who wanted to play with
Mhm.
me. Um, but yeah, I think this kind of thing is going on. I mean, if you look at, not to get too political, but if you look at the Ukraine stuff, the
Mhm.
money going, that's basically a hustle. I mean, it's just,
Mhm.
it's a hustle with taxpayer money.
Mhm.
This stuff's happening all over the place in all different areas. So I think it's really important that people are aware of these
Mhm.
dynamics,
Mhm.
and these principles. So, but everything can be a strategy if you want it to be. The way you walk can be a strategy. Actually, he talks about that in the book. He said he would specifically walk so that he was always ready for a duel because you never know when it's going to happen. And he said I would maintain relaxation. I would be relaxed, but I was
Mhm.
always walking in a pose where I was ready for a duel.
Mhm.
I mean, there's strategy. You can have strategies to how you walk. Like if you don't want to talk to people,
Mhm.
just walk real fast through a building. People won't come up and talk to you.
Mhm.
There's actually strategy to everything, and I think people
Yeah.
don't
Yeah.
realize that. You can use this. You can apply this. Um, yeah, to many different areas of life. So that's what I wanted to do.
Oh, very good.
Um, yeah.
Did you have more comments
So,
about it? Yeah.
I mean that's pretty much it. I think I mean, I can give you another couple examples of kind of the hustle thing. Like, there's some scene with uh, Christopher Walken in some movie. I saw the scene. I didn't see the movie. I don't know which movie it was, but he makes a bet with someone, and obviously he's an older guy, and he bets and he says, I guarantee you I can do between 300 and 400 push-ups. And everyone's like, no, 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 you can't. They bet the money, and then he does 4 push-ups, and he's like, pay up, because I did between 300 and 400. I did 4. So, there's stuff like that.
Yeah.
Apparently, I mean, who knows if this is true? Apparently, Amarillo Slim had a trick where he would bet people that he could throw a playing card, and he was very skilled at throwing playing cards. He bet he could throw a playing card out a window, and then the card would blow back up and stick to the back of the window. And people would bet all kinds of money. He would throw the card out the window, and he had a guy standing outside with a fan, and they would put a little bit of like sticky stuff on the back of the card. And so when it went out the window, the fan would stick it like right to just crazy stuff like this. But I'm actually saying that type of thing goes on in politics. That type of thing goes on in crypto markets.
Mhm.
Like there's a lot of manipulations going on that are in the same kind of way of thinking.
Mhm.
It's shady, but it's
Mhm.
strategic and it works. And I just think it's good for people to be aware of that. So,
Yeah, I think if you look for strategy in life, you can see it. In
mhm.
the movie The Matrix, they have the woman in red, and a woman wearing red is a strategy. So,
Yeah,
that color will attract the attention. Red lipstick is a strategy. Red
exactly.
shoes are a
Yeah,
strategy. And so if you
exactly.
look, you can see strategy in all kinds of things in life. Do you have some thoughts about that, Dean? Or have you read? I've read the book, the
I've
first.
never
Okay.
even heard of this book.
Okay,
Okay.
well,
Yeah.
it's worth reading. So, in coaching, we have this phrase, set yourself up for success. And really, what
Yeah.
we're asking you to do is to consider some strategies so that you
Hmm.
start on second base in the new job with your financial choices. You can set yourself up to come out of the gate strong. And,
Yes.
but it has to be deliberate. And so, yeah.
I I totally agree. Setting yourself up for success. And basically, I think it's very important for people to be aware of this way of thinking,
Mhm.
whether you adopt it, whatever extent you adopt it or don't is fine. But
Mhm.
um basically he's saying do whatever works. Like, and then your life just works.
Mhm.
I mean, it's like you just got to figure out what works and do that. Like
Mhm.
he talks about how other schools of swordsmanship, they look very impressive because they're doing such quick flourishes. And he's like, yeah, but I mean, that doesn't necessarily work in a fight.
Mhm.
So he's like,
Mhm.
okay, you look impressive, but if you fight me, I'm gonna win
Yeah.
because I know how to just get you off balance, get your
Mhm.
sword moved away a little bit, and then just go for the
Right.
stab. So it doesn't matter that you're
Mhm.
like doing
Mhm.
all this.
Mhm.
He's like, look, you do what works, especially when you're fighting to the death.
Of
That
course,
makes
samurai
that
style.
makes
Mhm.
perfect sense. You really have to just do what works. There's really no other way. Um, so yeah, and he was saying even that stuff like physical strength, he's like, it doesn't beat strategy. Strategy's gonna win. Like even if they have larger numbers in their army, it doesn't beat strategy.
Mhm.
You can make their numbers useless if you know what you're doing. Like
Mhm.
where they're all crowded in the middle and they can't even get to the outside to fight.
Mhm.
Doesn't mean anything then. Like so strategy, I just think it's really good to be aware of, like you're saying, set yourself up for success. And I do think sometimes we tend to fall back on our habits and we don't realize that habit is not setting ourselves up for success, you know? So
Mhm.
like switching our thinking to like, does this actually set me up for success? Is this
Mhm.
actually making my life more functional,
Mhm.
better over time?
Mhm.
I think it's good to do a review of that. Like, is my strategy at least decent in life? Um, so yeah.
Very good. So exciting. Well, I love that book choice, and I'll make sure it's in the show notes. And also the book from Amarillo Slim. I'll find it. And
Oh, and Dean, I want to tell you something. So whenever I
Okay.
would talk to my coach about philosophy, he would go, philosophy. That's what he called it.
Philosophy.
Whatever. Yeah, that like that was his little word for it. But this strategy was like the only thing he respected, like
I
just set your
see.
life up.
Funny,
Yeah,
funny.
that's what matters. Other theories, whatever. I care about what works. Like
Right.
that was his thing. Yeah.
Funny.
So, Dean, other than The Common Good, which is a very good book authored by you,
Yes,
do you have other
I should read that book.
you should. I should.
Yeah.
other books you wanted to talk
I think I would recommend that book to almost anybody.
about?
Well,
Nice.
it's interesting as you're talking, I can think of all sorts of books and writers who have influenced my general worldview and outlook, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, everyone from, starting with Plato.
Yeah.
Uh, but when I was a late teenager, I began reading a lot of Wendell Berry. Wendell Berry's probably America's most accomplished author. Um,
That I never heard of.
well, he lives here in Kentucky, and I think he's like 81 now. But a lot of his early nonfiction was about agriculture and the connection between the state of our agriculture and the state of our culture in general.
Mhm.
But
Nice.
the things, but his fiction um, really has influenced me a lot, and it's in its portrayal of people as sacred.
That's
And
awesome.
I met Wendell. I've met Wendell a couple of times, and one time I asked him, um, like what so, you've written all this nonfiction, sort of trying to influence agriculture policy, et cetera, et cetera. So what's the point of your fiction? He said, the only thing I ever tried, and this is a personal conversation that stuck with me forever. He said, the only thing I ever try to do when I'm writing fiction is show how people act when they love each other.
Hmm.
And
That's awesome.
and so he does that very well in those novels, and he's very good at showing in those novels how sort of the acquisitiveness of kind of contemporary American culture does things like ruins marriages. So particularly thinking of his novel called The Memory of Old Jack that he wrote in the 70s, in which the main character, basically his wife ends up leaving him. I think that's how it goes. His wife ends up leaving him, but the reason she leaves him as the end of a chain of events that's started by Jack's purchasing an additional field and switching from using a horse to a tractor. So this is very Berryan understanding of things, right? Like,
Yeah.
well,
Wow.
what happens is that when you automate, when you do this, it has this chain reaction that impacts things like your family in ways that you could not predict.
I love it.
So, that's someone who's really influenced my general worldview. I think too of like the short story writer Flannery O'Connor, who, very profound spiritual and religious point of view, in which the most true and poignant and important and good spiritual truths are constantly put into the mouths of the worst possible people.
Mm, wow.
The Her most famous story is called "A Good Man Is Hard to Find,"
Mm.
and it's about a family who's systematically murdered by a serial killer whose
Oh
name
my gosh.
who doesn't even have a name. He just goes by the Misfit. And just as he's about to kill this character called the grandmother, she offers a sincere and earnest prayer for the soul of the misfit just before he kills her. And afterward, the misfit says this very profound thing. And he says, she'd have been a good woman if she'd had somebody there to shoot her in the head every minute of her life. And what the point of that is that the more we remember our temporality, that we aren't going to be here forever, and the more we live free of the illusion that we are more than we are, right? The more seriously we take our actions, and the more humble we can be, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is like what the misfit is saying, but and it's a very important truth, right? Like, remember, you're only here, you're passing away, and so in the time you're passing away, do all the good you can. But it's said
Don't
by
wait till
this,
there's a gun to your head. Yeah.
right? And the misfit is saying that if somebody had a gun to her head all her life, she would have been good. So those are things that like sort of I think have like a really powerful effect on me in my terms of my general worldview. So there's a couple of them. But in terms of books that people are always asking me to recommend books. I'm terrible at thinking of books to recommend, but I was able to think of two for this one.
Yeah.
And the first one is a book from 1978 that was very popular when I was a kid. And then that I read later when I was an adult. I think I've actually read it twice. It's called The Road Less Traveled by M. Scott Peck.
Yeah.
I don't know if are you familiar with that book?
Mm-hmm. Well, and it comes from the Robert Frost poem, right?
Yes, it does. And I remember that book making a huge impact on me. I haven't read it in a long time, but a couple maybe last year I listened to the audiobook of his other most famous book, which is called People of the Lie, which is his exploration of how people become evil. And M. Scott Peck was an interesting character because he was a psychiatrist,
Mhm.
but he was also I don't think he wasn't evangelical, but he was definitely extremely highly influenced by Christianity.
Mhm.
And so a couple of years ago, I was talking to someone who administers a kind of a Christian discipleship program or something. And I mentioned that M. Scott Peck had been a real influence on me. And she was concerned about, what do you think of his theology? And I said, I'm actually unaware of his theology.
Nothing. I think nothing
Right,
is
right.
theology.
But I say that to say he's probably he may be too spiritual for the secular kind of reader, and for some
Insufficiently spiritual.
or right, insufficiently orthodox or something. But it's interesting, as I went back to review that book, I found that many of the ideas that I first encountered there actually ended up in the book I was talking about that I wrote. Particularly his emphasis on love as a kind of supreme moral power, and that and love as the fuel for change and growth. So so I remember I do remember the day I read the first sentence of that book, because when I was 22, 23, when I read it the first time, I had never articulated this to myself, because the first couple of sentences are something like, life is difficult. The sooner you accept that life is difficult, the easier it will become. And so he's very big on accepting reality, taking responsibility for yourself, and that love becomes the reason that you do what is required for you to grow, because it's sort of in the process of becoming the better you exercise love toward yourself and toward everyone else.
Yes.
That's a hugely influential and very powerful idea, I think. The other book that I often refer people to, which came out not too much later, is The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Are you familiar with that book?
Yes, I use it in my work all the time.
And Stephen Covey was a Mormon,
Yeah.
And his Mormonism doesn't enter in very much. His Mormonism doesn't enter in theologically, but it's very obviously influenced by a pretty traditional paradigm of what the person is.
Hmm.
That it's actually a paradigm that goes, in some ways all the way back to the Greeks. And in the end, the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People is just an explication of what it means in a very practical approach to creating character.
Yes.
And both of these books have very similar themes. I didn't realize that until I was preparing for this. I had never thought about that. But in both of them, they are arguing that the fulfilled human being is the one who takes his character seriously. May I ramble about something else for a moment?
Please.
Of course, yeah.
I have been also listening to this more recent book by a writer named Abigail Schreier called Bad Therapy, which I'm not recommending.
You're not recommending it.
No. I've actually been writing about it on Twitter. I've been pretty critical of it.
Mhm.
And she consistently argues that therapy, she says that therapy is the cause of all of the unhappiness in our society.
Here.
And the reason it's a cause is because it makes people take their unhappiness too seriously.
Mhm.
And
They're missing that first sentence from M. Scott Peck.
right. So it essentially, her argument is, as far as I can tell, people would be better if they thought about it less and just got on with essentially making money. Right. I mean, she's very big on achievement and on making money. And I would almost want to say that the philosophy that she's carrying forth is really contrary to the philosophy in the 2 books I just mentioned, in which your self-examination.
Love is not mentioned. I'm not.
What's that?
Love is not mentioned. I'm not hearing.
Love is not mentioned, but that, contrary to someone who says the problem is that people just think about their feelings too much and their past too much, that actually what these 2 other books are saying is that the process of your self-examination and the process of your examination of your past, the goal of that is that you would love and that you would be able to understand and to overcome the roadblocks that have been built into you in terms of what prohibits you from loving in that way, in the most profound ways, both yourself and other people. And she constantly is pointing out that she says therapy is obviously ineffective because people often feel worse after going to therapy. And so I think certainly what M. Scott Peck would say to that is, well, duh, right? Because before you came to therapy, you weren't in the truth, right? You were distracting yourself, you were repressing, you were in denial, and at some level you felt better. But our values are truth and love, and not how do I feel. And I think that all of that is hugely influential on my perspective, and really very influential on how I approach working with a client. In the background, those kinds of assumptions are always in my mind. I suppose I have, maybe this is a kind of a humanistic psychology thing, but really goes back to the Greeks, I think, is this notion that within all of us is a sort of roadmap to what we ought to be.
Yes.
And that but you can't access that without discipline and without love. And that and I think and M. Scott Peck talks about this as well. That's very difficult to do that without a guide.
Mhm.
And that a guy it's I suppose that's true with everything, but if you're going to access that plan inside of you that guides you through your own growth process across your lifespan, you things happen to you that screw that up, your access to that up, and you need a guide to help you get through that and to clarify those things.
Mhm.
So that's kind of the part of the way I even understand what coaching is. It's I'm trying to guide you into a situation where you can be more honest with yourself
Mhm.
and also even know what it feels like when your inner guidance system is speaking.
Yes.
So those are the two books I'd recommend. And
Hey,
I can
Brian,
say more.
I
What?
want Brian's thoughts first. That's tremendous. I really appreciate those books, especially now I have to read Mr. Barry. Is it Barry? But
Berry.
Berry. Okay. Brian, I think you have thoughts.
Well, I think what you said is tremendous, Dean. Like very profound, very deep. Yeah, it gives me a lot to think about. Here's a question, and to some extent, just connecting it back to what I said, when you talk about love as the fuel for personal growth and things like that, in some sense, you're thinking of love as a strategy. What does love accomplish?
Mhm.
Um, I think love goes way beyond that, but I'm just connecting the two.
Mhm.
May I say something to that? May I
Yes.
respond to that real quick? Yes,
Yeah.
that is actually true. I think I think that what love accomplishes is the good.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so
And so
love is a kind of,
Mhm.
we might say love is a strategy in some way for accomplishing the good.
Mhm. Mhm.
so that leads me perfectly into my next question I was going to ask you, which is, do you think it's two questions? Do you think people can be commanded to love? Or is that not possible? What's your stance on that? And then also, do you think people can will themselves to be loving? Or, like sometimes, for example, in the space of dating, marriage, attraction, people say, well, you can't force yourself to love someone. Like if the love went away, it went away. I don't know. Can you will yourself to love? Can we command others to love? Is that something people can actually do? I wonder what your viewpoint on that is.
I would say yes and no to both questions.
Okay.
So moving on. How would you like me to explain that?
I would
Um,
like you to explain a bit.
yes. Well, I think part, and this goes back to the thing about Peck too, right? Is that love is not ultimately and fundamentally a feeling, it is ultimately and fundamentally a value.
Okay.
And so that you can command someone to behave in a way that is commensurate and or consonant with that value. Okay. So yes, you can command someone to love. What you can't command is you can't command someone to feel warmly,
Yeah.
or you can't command someone to kind of feel, you can't command someone to want. Okay.
Yeah.
And so once you make a distinction between our use of the word love to mean a value and our use of the word love to mean a subjective feeling state, that's why you can say yes and no to both those questions, right?
Yeah.
It's yes when you think of love as a value, no when you think of love as a subjective feeling state. And I don't want to denigrate love as a subjective feeling state because that's important too. It's just I would probably use different word for that than love because I tend to, at least in this context.
That's a good answer. So then with viewing love as a value, in that sense, we can ask society to be more loving to each other
Oh
in
wow,
terms of, yeah, I mean, people aren't going to always feel the feelings of like, I really like this person or something,
right.
but as a value in terms of we can decide that we treat each other with consideration and as another sacred, wonderful human being and bringing that care, that respect to it, then we're living love as a value.
Mhm.
I think that we can ask people to do that, whether they choose to or not.
Mhm.
Sure.
I think there's a modern way to say that, and that is you can hate the game, but not hate the player,
Mm.
right? And I think love is a choice. And
Mm.
so, but I think sometimes you find difficult choices. Marriage as an example. If the spouse is cruel, you can love the spouse, but love yourself enough to step out of a cruel situation where you're being harmed. You can love yourself enough and choose that to say, I won't continue to be harmed. And so, or go ahead, your thought.
Well, I just want to say, right, like I
Mhm.
also I also tend to think that what is what is loving in the sense that it promotes growth is is typically not a matter of competition.
Mhm.
So that if you're in a marriage with a cruel and abusive partner,
Mhm.
moving away from that partner promotes the partner's growth as well as your own.
Yes,
And
it's a loving
therefore,
choice.
right.
Hmm. I also think that you can choose love when your circumstances change. And I know this is very common in the modern dating arena. I love him because he's a lawyer that bills at $500 an hour. I love him because he bought me a BMW. I love his performance in my life. And
Mhm.
then if he's laid off or the economy collapses or something, he's no longer performing. I'm falling out of love with him. Well, that wasn't love, really. And so, if your circumstances change, can you still choose love? Stories of someone who became disabled or had a long sickness, went through a cancer treatment. So I don't love our life while he's in chemotherapy for a year, but I love my husband and we're going to get through it. I'm choosing this love, even though our circumstances have changed. And so that's love as a value. And I also think it's a good strategy for life because finding the love in that person gives you the strength to manage difficult circumstances. Your love is stronger than the circumstances. And to keep choosing that is a more fulfilled life than to allow your love to be subjective to varying circumstances. And I think people who really want to have a fulfilled life are paying attention to choices and values like love. I know we go back to the statement at Delphi, know thyself, right? And I do think there's an internal compass that says, this is who I showed up as, my strengths and my weaknesses. This is where I fit and am happy, and can find contentment. So I would never be in a life circumstance where I have to run the 440 because I would not find happiness there or success. We should not do that for me. So I know myself well enough. No. And Brian and I were talking the other day, now that we're free from a 9 to 5 kind of environment, we have the stresses of the entrepreneurial life, but we embrace those because we value the freedom more than the security of being in a 9 to 5 job with a check that gets deposited twice a month into our bank account. And so I think those choices, if they're done with some strategy in mind, can lead to a fulfilled life. But I think love is always a good choice as long as you include love for yourself so that you're not being harmed. So,
Yeah. May I say, I know we're almost out of time, but
yeah.
I'll respond to that.
Mhm.
I would say, yes, that there is that almost always, I think, what we think of as selflessness, at least in many people I've encountered, let me say it that right. The attempt to be selfless is, in fact, an attempt to avoid love in the sense that it's an attempt to avoid real relationship
Mhm.
because real relationships can only happen between selves. And so the selfless person is often the person who um, suppresses, hides their desires and wants and thinks, I will want nothing, I will be nothing, I will need nothing in order to keep these people happy with me and avoid difficulty and conflict.
Mhm.
But when you avoid difficulty and conflict, you also avoid love and therefore growth.
Mhm.
You
Mhm.
mentioned the person who like makes some decision about love when their partner is going through chemotherapy. You mentioned that kind of situation.
Mhm.
And I would say that I think that the real test of a person's commitment to love as a value is the degree to which that person is willing to accept suffering they could otherwise escape.
Mhm. Mhm.
So you could escape the suffering of having a spouse with
Mhm.
cancer
Mhm.
just by getting in the car and driving away.
Mhm.
But when you are willing to accept suffering that you otherwise could escape, that's when you demonstrate your commitment to love as
Mhm.
a value.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
And that suffering is a kind of necessity for growth as well.
Yeah, I think the ego death, or the kinds of things spiritual people talk about, there's a component of suffering when you wake up to things not being the way you thought they were. You're forced to reorient. There's a kind of suffering in that reorientation. Somebody pulled my Jenga blocks,
Right. Right. That's why you feel worse after going to therapy.
yeah, because you're like, oh man,
Because
some
it
of that was
reorients
my
you worse.
fault. Doggone it, some of that
Right.
was my fault. Yeah, okay, maybe I could have seen that coming if I'd bothered to look. Okay, okay. So, all right. Well, I'll tell you the short story, and then I will say the book that I wanted to talk about, and I'll just include it here. Seven Habits is a book I use all the time, but in terms of strategy, a great strategy from that book is to begin with the end in mind.
Mm-hmm.
And so anticipate what that outcome is to these choices. And if that outcome is satisfactory, then put the plan together to deliver yourself that outcome or something close to it. But not to begin with the end in mind is planning and strategy. The other one, my fourth habit, is my favorite: seek first to understand and then to be understood. That's absolutely at the heart of coaching. To understand, what is it they seek, what is their capacity for making the changes they say they want. How can you measure their willingness to make those changes they say they want to get the end they have in mind? And so seeking first to understand and then to be understood is very, very powerful lesson. And I use it in coaching every day. So, but the short story that I wanted to mention from Ursula K. LeGuin, and I'm going to have to look up the title for it and I'll put it in the short notes, but it was The Fallacy of the Greater Good. And when I read that, I think I was 13 when I got into science fiction and fantasy books. And I loved how they made me think outside of my daily world, examine things that were not happening to a 13-year-old or a 14-year-old. And I had to think bigger. And the story is this village where every year they choose a small child and they trap it in a basement and they starve it to death. And that's the pact that they made with the gods of the area so that everyone else could have a good life. So the greater good for the village is that you sacrifice one child in this way. And it was an honor for the family to have the child be chosen, and they killed this child. And that's how they kept their good coming to them, is by forcing some kind of sacrifice on another. And the fallacy of the greater good is it's okay if I'm causing harm over here because most people are doing fine. And to really reflect upon that. And it really changed the way I thought about that. I mean, the ideas about socialism and communism and make everything the same for everybody. And Ursula K. Le Guin changed my mind about that as a 13-year-old. So it was a very powerful story. Like, how could anybody do that for any reason, including the greater good? Like, there is no greater good worthy of starving a child in a basement.
Are you familiar with Kurt Vonnegut's short story called Harrison Bergeron?
No.
You might
I'm
like that as
I'm
well.
familiar. Yeah.
Yeah. It deals in a tangential way with some of those same themes.
No. It definitely changed my idea about philosophy of the greater good. Then
Hmm.
the last book I was going to mention, and this is just a generic book for women executives or people who manage women executives. And we used it in women's leadership conference that we put on in Austin a few years ago called How Women Rise. And I'll include it in the show notes. But basically, it talks about how men and women are different, which should come as no surprise. And so the way that they interact, the way they communicate, the way that they navigate the work world is also different. But most of the work world was originally inhabited by men. So most of the systems are designed to be highly functioning for men. And women have been sort of inserted in these places, but there's some breakdown in how they function differently. And the most popular, it talks about 20 differences that you find in female executives that you do not find typically in male executives. The most popular choice from these women that attended this luncheon conference was ruminating. Every single woman in the room, do any of you do this? A couple hundred hands went up. And ruminating is you just can't let go of something. It's circling on your mind. You feel like it was unfair, or you said the wrong thing, or the way something was said to you was wrong, or you told Sally, but you didn't tell me. Whatever it is, you ruminate about it. And that men more commonly let it go and move on. And that is an expectation in the workplace that you should let it go and be able to move on. And women, some of them have to be taught how to do that. That, while it might be natural for you to keep running that on rinse and repeat in your brain, here's how to let that go. And that if you're going to be in senior leadership in the Western world, the expectation is that you'll be able to let things go. And so, yeah, that's one of 20. But that was the most commonly, rated one, that they do that. Will sometimes hang on to something and don't know how to process it and release it so it's gone. So, yeah, this is a book of a woman who's been coaching executives for more than 20 years, female executives, about how women rise. Here's some changes you can make so that you're in flow with how a business is done today. So, yeah, those two books. Okay, any final
Cool.
thoughts, Brian? Let's start with you.
Final thoughts? I don't know. I mean, I guess just responding to what you said. Yeah, I totally agree. I think men and women have a ton of differences, and I do think that presents challenges in the workplace as well.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I mean, I do think originally, yes, these systems were set up for men. I do think that women also have a lot of advantages in the workplace too now, and that doesn't really get spoken about as
Oh,
much.
sure. Oh, I didn't mean, yeah, any
Well,
different.
yeah. I'm not like, yeah.
Mhm.
Um, so, but yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think that can be kind of a tough issue. Um, I don't know. I don't really have answers on that one. I think there's
Do
always going to be some issues with that.
you
I don't know
have
if there's
some
like a,
thoughts about the greater good?
yeah. So, I mean, if you going along with kind of what you're saying, I mean, you can get into like Ayn Rand stuff where, really it's more true that there's individual good. Like one of a different, and I'm not saying there's no good of society as a whole.
Oh, of
It's there's
course.
some semantic issues here, but
Mhm.
um one problem with the greater good is if you like make decrees and you issue this for society, this is what we're going to do. Well, I mean, how do you know that's what everyone in the society wants?
Mhm.
You know, there isn't you have to kind of consider what is the good for each individual. It's not the same thing for everyone.
Mhm.
Um and when you do have a society that kind of just tries to blanket everything like a communist society or a fascist society, everyone has
Mhm.
to go with this. That
Mhm.
works for some people, doesn't work for others. That's kind of the beauty of the American dream, which has kind of been disappearing. Maybe it's coming back now. Um, but was that the individual could create the life they wanted. They could pursue the life they wanted. Yes, they still had to abide by the laws,
Mhm.
but every individual can create their own version of the good life.
Mhm.
It wasn't so much like the 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 greater good just flattened everybody, you
Mhm.
know? So Yeah, I mean, I think that speaks to your point. I mean, like Ayn Rand has one of her short stories was called Anthem,
Mhm.
and it's the premise of the book is the word I has been eliminated from the language. People are only allowed to say we. So you've fully lost the sense of individuality.
Individual.
You kind of just always have to go with the group. There's like no
Mhm.
resistance.
Mhm.
People can't even think of themselves apart from the group anymore. It's been like
Mhm.
taken out of the language.
Mhm.
But really, I mean, we need a balance of individual good and the good of society based on the things that most people want. I think most people want safe cities, healthy food,
Yeah.
reasonable
Roads that
prices,
work.
good
Yeah.
opportunities to make money. I
Mhm.
mean, freedom of speech. Like, I mean, everyone used to agree with that in America. I know there's people that don't know, but that was just obvious to everyone for decades in America.
Mhm.
Um, if you're gonna focus on the common good, it should be things or the greater good. It should be things like that, where pretty much everyone's on board. There's always going to be a few people who are against anything, but
That's
that's what I could
great.
say to
Thanks.
your points. Yeah.
So, tell people how to get a hold of you at a life design where we encourage people to design their lives.
Yeah, just a lifedesign.org. Um, good place to reach me. Yeah.
And you're also on Instagram.
Yeah, it's a Special K coaching on Instagram.
No, very good. I'll put those in the show notes. Dean, any final thoughts and how to get a hold of you?
I think the story you were talking about brings to mind the phrase Jordan Peterson often uses of the importance of the divine individual,
Oh,
and that once we cease to believe that human beings are in and of themselves sacred, anything goes,
mhm,
and that that the limit of the common good is always um, the exploitation of the individual, right? So that what keeps the collective from becoming dystopian
mhm,
is its its high regard for the individual experience, and
mhm,
that becomes sort of like the curb that keeps the collective from going off the rails.
mhm,
And that's LeGuin's point probably as well. Right?
mhm. Yeah,
People can find me, dnabbott.com or at dnabbott on Twitter is the
at
easiest
Dean
thing.
Abbott. Okay, very good. Well, I'm on alifedesign.org and we'll share how to find everybody in the show notes. This was really a fun discussion. And
Yeah, it was.
let's keep choosing love. Why not? Let's keep choosing love. So, okay, you guys, thanks so much for this one, and we'll see you at the next one.
Thank you.
Yep. See you, Dean.
See ya.